I think that the Maneuver Warfare Center of Excellence, and I think the United States Army, is at the early stages of a renaissance. And I believe that for two reasons. The first is because you have to be. We're at a period where our enemies respect us, but they don't fear us. The specter of American power is no longer enough to get somebody just not to do something. And so in the future, we are going to have to prove what we can do time and again, as we have over the last more than decade. But that'll be the immediate future as well. But what we did in the past, what you did, the people in this room did so well, isn't going to be good enough. It will be interesting history, there will be plaques, there will be books written about it, there will be all kinds of good things, but it's just not going to be sufficient for what has to happen in the years ahead. And I think you all know that. That's the theme of what's been said by every speaker before me today. The second reason I think you are at the first stage of a renaissance is because you've got the right people here now. We've got a unique population, particularly the leaders here. They grew up in a period when we were largely focused on training, and then they have lived the last half of their careers, the last 20 or so years, as a very high op tempo, and then a tremendous amount of combat. So people who've seen what it takes to train a force, to employ a force, and now to reshape a force. Now, I'm in a happy position. I retired 4 years ago, and that's a pretty good place. So what do you do when you're retired? Well, you play a lot of golf. But in fact, I'm told there's a limit to how much golf you can play. I don't golf, so it doesn't apply. So I bought a kegerator. And I was told that there's a limit to how much beer you can drink, but I'm still testing that hypothesis. Most dangerously, you have time to think. You know, when you're doing it, you spend an awful lot of time executing, and you get a chance to have wonderful conversations. Scott Miller and I used to spend hours in Iraq just talking about what was happening and what we needed to do. But now I've had a chance without anybody beating on me just to think about things. So what you're going to hear for the next little bit is sort of what I think about things. And I'm not asking you to agree. I'm just asking us that we all think. Now, I'd ask you what you think about this, because if you went to northern England on a winter evening, you might see this. That's starlings, up to 500,000 starlings. There's no plan, there's no written operations order. It's not even apparent that there are any non-commissioned officers controlling that. But look at what you see, this incredible adaptive ability to change direction and do what they must do. And so we need to hold that thought. I've thought about it, and I've come up with what do you need to do, and that's it. That's the solution. This is the Infantry School, so put it in a document. Give me credit for it. No, it's not that simple. So I'll take you to September 30th, 2004 in Baghdad. Some of you may remember this. There was a water plant that was being opened. And there's a fair amount of fanfare around that, and a suicide bomb came in, drove right through Iraqi children, over some, through adults, into the facility, exploded. People immediately converged to the people who were badly injured, and a second vehicle came in, drove right into the crowd, and also detonated. Now, a suicide bombing is not a new tactic in the world. It's not something that the world had not seen before, but the effect of things like vehicle-borne IEDs in Iraq was different from what we had ever seen before, because the effect they had was not just to terrorize the people locally, it was to literally cause the country to go into spasms, and it reverberated around the region and around the world and into living rooms in the West and in the United States. It had an effect that we were not prepared for. A tactic had a strategic effect. So this talk is not a moral talk about what's right and wrong, whether suicide bombs are right. This is a discussion on how we are going to look at organizational leadership in the future, how I think we've got to consider it. I spent almost 5 years as a part of Joint Special Operations Command. Many of you have heard the acronym JSOC, and it was a transformative experience for me because I had gone through most of my career, 70s, 80s, 90s, largely at peace, in a bunch of different units, but then when I got into Iraq in the fall of 2003, things were very different from what I was mentally prepared for. I may have had the skills and the rank and whatnot, but when I joined this organization, an elite collection of forces, I thought that I was joining an unbeatable team because we were better resourced, we were better trained, we were specially selected. You had this combination that no country in the world probably had ever put together, with an extraordinary track record to boot. And there are some of the founders and icons of it in this room today. But in 2004, here's what we were. Elite, that's a good thing. Well-resourced, extraordinarily well-resourced, that's a good thing. We were efficient. What we did, we could do better than anyone had ever done it before. We were also losing. Now that's a disconnect because the things we were doing were going very well. When we went on an operation, we did it well, we had good results, but we were losing the war. And it's like having a high batting average on a team that's in the cellar. And losing, all of you in this room know, isn't like going home after the 9th inning, a little bit disappointed. It's watching people's lives be shattered around you. The people of Iraq, the people of Afghanistan, their lives in tatters, and you can't stop it. So it was evident to a number of us that something was different. It wasn't just the things that people say, but we're not 100% sure what it called for. So we'll look at what changed, we'll look at what we needed, and then how we did it. Now, what had changed? Some things had not changed. This is me in college. Cheap beer, nice trousers. I passed those trousers down to General LaCamera, then a captain, who still wears them. Then my life changed. I met a girl I fell in love with, and when I was a young second lieutenant, I'm in Fort Monroe, Virginia, back when it was still a post, and I'm standing in front of the altar at Fort Monroe about to get married. I'm standing next to Captain McChrystal, an Army chaplain, my brother, and he's about to marry us. I'm looking down the aisle, and I see the most beautiful girl in the world. And I'm thinking, I have just won the lottery. And then you look at her dad. 30-year tanker, Korean War veteran, went all the way to the Yalu River and back. Vietnam veteran, and look at that, he's armed. But how much better could I have it? But what could change? Now I'm in love. Well, here's what changed. She had a kid. And I did what everybody did with a son. You know, I took him like a toy. I swung him around, had a great time. And my wife did what every wife did. She goes, don't do that, you'll give him brain damage. So I'm not going to give him brain damage. This is my son in high school. Little bit of brain damage. So things change. Your life changes whether you want to or not. But what was changed about the new environment? We all hear this. People get in front of us and they use great words for the new environment. I don't even know what recursive is, but I think it's different. Things are different. It doesn't matter. I got it. It's different. What do I do differently? Well, there are two big changes that I think really drive it. The first is tight coupling. Now, what does that mean? That means things are interconnected in a way they never were before. If you think of two valleys in Afghanistan that may be 2 kilometers apart, they may have very little connection. Their life may go on with almost no interaction. But the rest of society increasingly is connected in ways we don't even understand. Think of a computer network, think of a power grid, Think of an ecosystem. And all of the people, things in the life chains, food chains, and whatnot are connected, and suddenly something happens to one critter somewhere. You say, okay, that critter went extinct or something happened to him, and oops. And it's so complex, it's impossible to predict. And things got faster. And you say, okay, got faster. I got it. I got a cell phone. I can call people and whatnot. No, things have gotten faster in a way that is algebraic, that we can barely conceive of. Think of how things happened before. Things went from point A to point B. Think how they're getting there now. And suddenly our thinking about time and our thinking about what we do. Mike Flynn talked about our decision-making and information processes are so out of sync with the flow of information in the real world. So these two changes together challenge this, because this is what we grew up with. We grew up with the elegant solution. Go in most offices and you'll see the elegant solution on the line because it's organized. Why do we like it? We like it because it goes from the top in straight lines down to the bottom. We know where everybody falls. Everybody's got a box. Information goes up, back up to the chain of command. If somebody over in one part's got to communicate with another part of the organization, there's a process to do that. You just open up the manual, this is the way it goes, all is synced, there's order, there's efficiency, there is predictability. And that was really good. It was solving a problem as we went into the industrial age where we needed to harness things for big industrial processes. So that came in. Think of a case where they were solving another problem. In the First World War, the French suffered this incredible bloodletting. They lost so many young men that it changed the population of France for generations. And so one of the things they did in the 1930s was create something to prevent the reoccurrence of the First World War. And the defense minister proposed and created something called the Maginot Line. And it was designed to prevent that trench-on-trench agony that they had gone through for 4 years in the First World War. And it stopped the French border being invaded directly by the Germans, their enemy. And it was a pretty amazing thing. It was an engineering masterpiece, gun turrets correctly sited with the terrain, and it went down low. You went down elevators to multiple layers. There were ammunition stores. There was even a railroad that took you from different parts, so a small number of forces could be very efficiently protected and employed to stop huge numbers of forces. Now, the thing about the Maginot Line is everybody says it was a monument to stupidity, but the reality is the Maginot Line worked. The Germans did not breach the Maginot Line. There was not a repeat of the trench warfare of the First World War. What happened, though, was the problem changed. The Germans simply went around it. And so the French came up with a rational solution to a problem that was irrational in its holistic sense. And its great danger is it gave people confidence that they should not have had. Go back to our elegant solution and talk about confidence in our solution, in the order of it. We like to be in tiers. We tier by ranking. Typically seniority, expertise, pay grade, how good your parking space is. And then we put ourselves in silos, typically functionally. Everybody that works in a certain area, all the armor guys here, all the infantry guys here, because you're hanging out with people who have your expertise, and most of your work is done inside that silo. That's the expectation. And that's okay as long as you've got adequate time for information to go up and down these fairly rigid but orderly processes. But it was challenged if speed suddenly overcame you, if you had to do things faster than that. And it challenged if the fact all your work was not inside your silo. It assumed that you had an exclusive relationship so that almost everything that was done in here could be done inside there. But if that wasn't the case, if suddenly you got a requirement for people in different parts of the organization to communicate. You got to bring people from cross-functional areas together at speed. Suddenly, speed and tight coupling undoes you because you are rigidly inflexible. Even though you think you're not, even though you've hooked this up with technology and you can do it faster than ever before, if you are still going through the old process, it's still overcome. So what do we think we needed to do? I go back to Iraq. This is 2000. I took over in 2003, early 2004, and I look at the problem. JSOC was all the things I described, elite and whatnot, but we were a hierarchical structure because that's the way we grew up with. That's what looks normal. That's span of control. That's what's logical. We were a very efficient one, and we were very empowered with information technology, but at the end of the day, we were that structure. That structure was powerful. In many ways, it gave us the ability to do processes very, very effectively. We could measure those processes. We were efficient, optimized. And so our goal was efficiency, how well we could do things with the least resources. And then we look at Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Excuse me. We'll go back to efficiency for a second, because why were we so focused on that? Well, really, in the industrial age that began in the 19th century, and we started to have the ability to do mass production, you needed ways to make that more efficient. And a guy came along named Frederick Winslow Taylor, fascinating character. He grew up in Philadelphia, the son of a fairly well-to-do lawyer, and he got accepted to Harvard. But he was having trouble with his eyes. He was getting headaches when he read, so he made the decision not to go to Harvard and instead take a job on a factory floor, and became fascinated by efficiency, not on the machine itself, but on how people interacted with the machine. Because before, you had a tradition of craftsmen, and the craftsman would say, how do you do it? Each craftsman had his own way of doing it, even when it was interfacing with a machine. And he said, well, that's ridiculous. We are going to make people almost part of that mechanical process, and we're going to make it frighteningly efficient. He would sit on factory floors with a stopwatch. He would time everything, and his impact was amazing. He produced best practices. He wrote a pamphlet called Scientific Management that, in fact, has driven much of how we run organizations even to this day. And it comes down to something called reductionism. And the idea is, if you can take any large task and break it into its component pieces and then make each piece as efficient as possible, all you do is link them back together and you've got a very efficient outcome. And we tended to take individuals and use reductionism and train individuals to be specially trained for a very limited job. And on assembly lines, it was his idea. You don't train anybody on anything but what they do. You don't want them second-guessing on other things. You want them entirely focused. In fact, he was fairly extreme in his views of how stupid workers ought to be. So it's pretty offensive, but at the time, it produced amazing results. And if we think about an example of that, think of an assembly line. The machine goes, the people serve the line, and they serve the process. And if they serve it well, it produces extreme amounts of output compared to what you did before. Now, if we look at Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they weren't a hierarchical organization. We kept trying to put them in one. We would get on whiteboards and we'd draw them out. And we'd say, here are the top guys, here's the next tier, et cetera, because that was logical to us. That made sense. But that didn't make sense to them because that's not the way they had generated the organization. They had generated with a network of associations. I don't think they could have drawn their own organization accurately. And I don't think they worried too much about it. They grew organically because they were under pressure from us as much as we could put, and so it became a very resilient, flexible organization. And they were adaptable because that became the DNA that worked. And when you pitted adaptable against efficient, surprisingly to us, adaptability won. Now, if we go back to what efficiency is, we say it's getting the most Y with the least X. That means I want to make the most cars with the least steel. I want to take the objective with the least soldiers. And if you think about it, that makes an awful lot of sense. How efficient can you be? There's one thing you have to know to do that. You have to know what Y is. You have to know what you're trying to do. And if we talk about understanding the problem, if we don't have Y right, or if Y changes constantly as it does today, then trying to solve for X is a fool's errand. Because speed and tight coupling have produced a new environment, emergent properties we'll call it. It's an essentially new thing where old processes and old expectations just don't work. You can do them as well as your father and your grandfather and your grandmother and everybody else did them, and they don't work the same because the environment's different. Al-Qaeda wasn't 10 feet tall, but they got on an up elevator of a changed environment. So now you're here back to say, well, we're used to getting the most Y with the least X, so what are we doing? Well, every day we're doing something different. Every day we're solving for a different Y. And so adaptability becomes your goal. You know, we throw these things up, we need adaptable leaders. We need to know exactly what we think that means. One way, as Peter Drucker said, it's the difference between doing things right and doing the right thing. Now, what do we mean here? We did things right. We did things according to our SOPs, according to our process, according to our doctrine. The enemy did what worked. Remember the old saying I got from Dave Grange years ago? If it's stupid and it works, it ain't stupid. How do we turn that around? How do we change that? Well, that was the challenge. Keep the strengths that we had, the inherent efficiency, because you can't throw efficiency out, but change so that we take that, but we reach adaptability. Now, how do we do that? In that command, we had the gift of having wonderful small teams already. You're familiar with a really good fire team, really good squad, really good basketball team. We've all been on one. You finish each other's sentences. You know exactly what they're doing. You don't have to spend a lot of time talking about what's to be done because there's just a bond that's been built over time. Think about when 2 aircraft went into the compound in Abbottabad, one of them crashed on the way in. Now think about that. 50% of your force going in on the most politically sensitive raid of the last decade, maybe more, and 50% of the force is broke on the way in. You think, we got a problem. But the question is, maybe you don't. If we think of a team as the sum of its parts, then we simply say if a team is X number of people and we put the talent of those people together, we're going to get a great team. But that's not always true. That's the dream team fallacy. Remember the story of the 2004 U.S. men's Olympic basketball team? After years of dominating, took the best basketball players, the National Basketball Association, went to Olympic Games and got a bronze medal, embarrassed themselves. Because in reality, a team is not simply the sum of the talent of the people. The SEALs love to put out, this is one of their calendars they put out. And all the SEALs do look like that. Yeah, I got it. But if you think about it, we've grown this myth into special operators or infantrymen or SEALs, you put whatever name, and we've said the reason that they are so special, and civilians say this to me all the time, you know, you don't look nearly as special as you should. Well, thank you. Because the reality is people who do great things may not individually be amazing. SEALs have got to swim 2 miles with fins in 75 minutes. That's hard. But a 64-year-old lady without fins swam 2 miles in less than that time, and then she went on to swim 108 more miles every 2-mile leg under that time. So it's not Superman. We're not talking about tasks that people can't do. Ranger School is not a collection of just insurmountable tasks. It's the cumulative effect of challenge to which a person must ride. And that is what makes a team. It's a combination of trust and purpose. And we know trust is something that's intangible. It's created within a team, between people, and between organizations. And we know that purpose is a fundamental alignment. Now, when we say purpose, I don't think it's just alignment on our mission today. I also think it's alignment on what we are. We are soldiers. We believe in certain things. We have a common purpose about our being and our sense of why we're in this organization. And you put trust and purpose together, and small teams get pretty special. There's an emotional tie of trust and purpose. There's an intellectual tie because they all are informed of what they're trying to do. And we call that now shared consciousness. And that shared consciousness is a sort of a special thing. It's emergent, intelligent awareness where everybody knows. It's not where you're on a knee with your rucksack in the middle of the dark waiting for the platoon sergeant or squad leader to tell you what you're wondering, where are those guys taking us? It's instead, everyone is aware. That's an anthill. And that was created by literally hundreds of thousands of ants. Each of one has about 750,000 brain cells. I know people with that amount, but it's less than most. Ants don't think, and the queen doesn't run the place. They organically operate like the starlings you saw, and they produce extraordinary things. Had to get mathematical on you. So here's what I'm saying. The excellence of a team is individual excellence times the shared consciousness between the members. So what I'm saying is if your shared consciousness is very low, no matter how high your individual excellence is, you're going to have a low outcome. And that individual excellence and shared consciousness become the big drivers. Now, if you take this up, if you scale this, you say the same thing applies. Excellence at a given level is excellence one level down, the subordinate units, with the shared consciousness one level down. Take this to an organization we might be familiar with, SEAL. So you have a SEAL team as a function of the SEAL talent in it and then the shared consciousness that they have between them. If you raised it up to the Special Operations Force we had, we were no more than the function of the subordinate organizations and the shared consciousness between the teams. We used to run exercises. For many years, we ran a series of exercises to bring this complex team together, and we had different parts of the task force. And it was interesting because we would go somewhere and we would spend literally millions of dollars doing a complex operation, and at the end of which the idea was we would be very, very interoperable. But many of the exercises looked a bit like this. There'd be 3 task forces, very capable. The first task force would go out and hit a certain kind of target, normally commensurate with their area of expertise. The second would hit another, maybe a hostage rescue or something. The third would hit another, maybe an airfield. They would do the mission on the target. They would come back to the base. We would have done this simultaneously, and we would have commanded and controlled it together, but in reality, we would have said we did a deeply integrated operation. But in fact, most of the people in those 3 task forces never saw anybody in another task force. And they didn't work through problems that way. They were just doing separate that were pulled together. And so we created, in my mind, a deception on ourselves that we had created this very synchronized, integrated organization, when in fact we had not. Not at the higher level. At the lower levels, it was strong. So the shared consciousness between the teams had not been exercised. It gets to what General McFarland was talking about, is you're bringing the combined arms and joint parts of the force together. If you don't do it, you can't just read about shared consciousness. It has to be built and exercised. So how do you scale it when you got to be bigger than a small team? First, there's an intellectual synchronization that you've got to build. You've got to share information, much more than we've ever done before. And you've got an emotional synchronization that you've got to do at the small team between people and at larger teams between teams. And I would say there are a couple ways to do this. The first, intellectual synchronization. When we think of NASA, what do we think of? High tech, Tang, went to the moon, that sort of thing. The amazing thing about NASA was how they developed the Apollo project, because they were geographically dispersed and they were creating engineering products that had never been built before, but they weren't doing it in the same room. Now think about that. You're trying to all build one thing that has to work together. You're geographically spread. You are culturally spread, because some people are engine people, some people are material people, some people are computer people. And they linked together 250 different radio nets in all of the locations. And they had a number of systems engineering processes that allowed them to communicate constantly, and then they had a forced rhythm in which they coordinated things to keep things wired together. And it's a process that was first developed in bombers in World War II, but NASA did an extraordinary thing. And if you think about it, in a decade, they took materials that didn't exist, created machines that had not been invented, and they did something no one had ever attempted before. In Joint Special Operations Command, my experience, what we had to do was take a group of really talented organizations, really effective, and bring them together. One of the things we did was we started having a daily video teleconference in which we brought not just key leaders together in one spot, but we linked people on video teleconference. We did it every day. And it was about 90 minutes, sometimes went to 2 hours, and it synced everybody. And it turned out to be extraordinarily effective in creating that shared consciousness where everybody has a sense of what's happening and therefore can act with confidence without going back up for guidance. Because this centralized communications forum actually creates and allows decentralized execution. But you got to have emotional synchronization too. You can have things that sort of mechanically hook organizations together, but think Department of State, Central Intelligence, military, different cultures, different languages, different personalities, different equities. And if you have frequent casual exposure where you get together and you go in a room and you shake hands and you say, yeah, we'll work together, we all know that that's not deep enough. You don't mean not to work together, but you don't. Neither individuals nor organizations. And so what I believe is you've got to have meaningful embedded exposure. I'm a great believer in liaisons. You put liaisons with somebody, but you have to empower your liaisons so they're of value to the force you're sending them to. Now, speed. It's something we have a lot of, but we don't drive it. It's not a choice anymore. We don't say we're going to be faster than everybody else, so that's going to be our decisive advantage. I will tell you, everything in the environment is going to be faster than us, and we are going to have to try to catch up, as are all the participants. So it's a very different idea. Speed, you could say it's doing the right thing, fast enough to be relevant. It's like Mike Flynn put out, if you're analyzing something and the train's already moved, it's not very important. Now, this was our traditional model. We all know this one. It's the pyramidal hierarchy. Information goes up. People at the top do the thinking. They send the commands down, and the people at the bottom do the doing. And why was it that way? Well, think about it. Armies were sort of that way, and you had big mass armies because the goal of mass armies was to get enough combat power concentrated at the same time and place to be overwhelming. So it took a lot of organizational structure to do that. And there were some artful things done. Think of the First World War, amazing coordination of artillery and whatnot, but it was very inflexible. And so armies had this centralized command and control because they had to. Navies, on the other hand, we sent Admiral Perry off to open up Japan, and we said, we'd like relations with Japan. Let us know how it works out. I mean, think about us sending an admiral. It wasn't even an admiral, it was a commodore. Send him and go, define our relations essentially with the East, not just Japan. Define our relations, use your best judgment. Not likely. But why did they do that? Because they had to. Communications didn't support micromanaging him. Admiral Perry was far away, he could do what he pleased because they couldn't be leaning over his shoulder, and they lived with it, and it was just kind of okay. Today, there's this thing I call the seduction of situational awareness. I used to be able to sit in a command center and I'd have 10 or 12 video screens up, and you'd see real-time predator downlink of all these different operations going on. You see them, you know what's going on, you got this great view of the battle, you got the great view. And we had a system where radio calls, tactical FM radio calls, were pumped into our secure internet, so anywhere in our organization, we could listen or talk all the way down to the individual operator. Now think about that. So we could watch a team hitting a target, Helicopters going in, team on target. We could listen to what they're saying. We could say, hey, Joe, you ought to go left, not right. But we never did it. Because you don't know. You don't know how cold it is. You don't hear the shooting. You don't know what's happening. The individual who's in charge and the people down there know. But yet there's a danger that when you see you've got this very two-dimensional view of things, you suddenly start to say, well, I understand. Look at all the pundits on TV saying, here's what we ought to do about ISIS. And they're saying that from thousands of miles away, and what do they know? What they saw on TV the day before by somebody who doesn't really know too much. So in reality, you start this cycle of, I don't know much, but I'll share it with you. But you have the seduction that thinks you do. And if I see something 6 times on TV, that don't make it 6 times right. The plural of anecdote is not data. And so we in today's world have got to understand that there's this call to think because we can see that we now have a responsibility to control things that we didn't before. So what do? You combine them. You take your organization, you have to do this. Everybody has to think and everybody has to do. You can't be so specialized that people at the top are the font of all knowledge and wisdom and the people at the bottom execute because it's too slow. In fact, you've got to change the function of the people at the top is to push information down across the organization, then people simply execute. Execute without detailed guidance. Now you say, well, that'll never be coordinated and synchronized. Well, it won't be quite as clean as we had in some of our airline battle doctrine. I remember I was a company commander when we were first doing airland battle and we're bringing in fighters and artillery and I'm maneuvering my tracks across the NTC and I could never do it. And I became convinced that most of us really couldn't do it. We wanted to be able to do it, but we couldn't. So our doctrine was actually out ahead of our ability to execute it. And so I believe what we've got to do now, because that trend is going so much faster, that the communications and technology has not allowed us to master the environment. The opposite has occurred. The emergent properties I talked about you have produced so much more data that we are seeing a smaller and smaller percentage of what's out there every day. And so instead of thinking we are going to get this savior from big data, we're going to understand and we're finally going to be able to micromanage the problem, it's the opposite. The problem is going exponential because people connect so fast that the world changes. If you went back 100 years ago and you had a guy go into a marketplace in Tunisia and get up on a soapbox and start making anti-government comments, the Tunisian government wouldn't know who the character was because they don't have the ability to do it. And they'd have kind of gone, all right, that's interesting, but it's not a big threat because the only people who hear him are the people here. And for that information to pass is pretty hard. But go to December 2010 and Mohammed Bouazizi pours gasoline on himself, has his cousin film it, burns himself, eventually dies from it. And within about 6 weeks, the Egyptian government falls. Not just the Tunisian government. And yet the Tunisian government could have known all about Mohammed Bouazizi because they have all the data. But no one could have predicted how that would go viral because it's not predictable anymore. So now we've got to go to that model. We've decoupled the relationship between information and control. Because you have it, you've got to go to empowered execution. Not because it's nice, not because it's thoughtful and it makes your subordinates feel good, because it's all that works. The decision has got to be made by the person, the lowest level that can make the decision. That's uncomfortable. So we're inverting the model. We've got shared consciousness, which allows you to do empowered execution which supports the creation of shared consciousness, and what we call it now is cross-lead. We're going from this, and I know many of us look at that and we go, it's really kind of comfortable, because this was good. If someone said you were efficient, if one of my officer evaluation reports when I was younger said, he's efficient, I go on home and showed my wife. They say I don't suck, which I usually did. Instead, where we had once believed in Frederick Winslow Taylor, smart guy, here's where we are. And it changes constantly, every moment. That's where we have to be as individuals and leaders. That has to be where organizations are. And as we go, it's personal, it's organizational, I think it's global.